thank you, Campbell. I loved your talk, and it's interesting. You've kind of introduced mine by saying weird and wonderful, and it's being equipped with light. So I'm going to bring on some light, I hope, but a very specific form of light. And mine starts with a story. And up until about 5 or 7 years ago, maybe it is now, I had no idea about lasers other than surgeons use them to cut things with, and that was probably the end of it. And you can shine them at airplanes when you shouldn't, and it doesn't do good things for them. So what happened for me is I got a phone call from someone in Auckland who said, look, my wife has a particular nasty problem, and would I be willing to see her? And I thought, that's a bit unusual. Basically, she was a middle-aged woman who'd had 18 months with a vertebral abscess with Staph aureus already sampled. She'd got 2 of her lower thoracic vertebrae were caved in, and she had ongoing collections of pus and material around them. And so she'd been on antibiotics for all of that time. It was causing a lot of pain, decreased mobility, gives you a bit of an idea of it. And the problem was that if she stopped her antibiotics, mixtures of oral and intravenous antibiotics in a series of courses, but no stopping during that time, if she did, her her CRP would shoot up, white count would go up, and she'd be very unwell. And she was facing the possibility of a cardiothoracic surgeon going in through an anterior approach to try and clean out her thoracic spine, with all the potential morbidity and even mortality from that operation. So her husband, who happened to be an entrepreneur, quite a successful one, I'm glad to say, had done some research, and he asked me one of those questions that, for my own part, patients asking questions have been one of my sort of leading edge of finding out about things. I think Campbell hinted at that. And he said, what do you know about hyperbaric oxygen and osteomyelitis? And I confessed I didn't know a lot, but I knew some. And he then sent me a raft of research papers, both preclinical and clinical, showing that there was a potential effect. And as he found out that I had a hyperbaric chamber, he said, we're coming down to get treated. And I said, well, all right then. And so they did. And so his wife was the one being treated, and she started a series of treatments. I've been trained in hyperbaric medicine, so it was something I'm kind of used to doing. But halfway through that initial treatment, he then said the second question, which is where we're leading to, and that is, what do you know about lasers? In this case, I really didn't have much. He again came out with a whole series of research papers showing that lasers can help both osteomyelitis and staphylococcal infections. Now, I don't expect many of us in here or in the audience have a lot of knowledge about that, but in fact, they do exist. And the next thing was one of those sentences which are magic to my ears. He said, look, if I can find the right laser according to the research, he'll have it here in 3 days from anywhere in the world. And I said, wow, okay, let's give that a go. And I found the one that seemed to be most appropriate in terms of frequency and power and so forth, and said, look, it's in America, it's 25,000 US, are you happy about that? And he indeed delivered it the next week, somehow managed to get it there. And we started her treatment using that laser along with the hyperbaric. That's the laser, I'll mention a bit more about it. And within a week or so, her pain was starting to improve a bit. And then she finished a series of treatment, went away, had an MRI. The MRI actually showed some improvement, which was good to see. They then returned, as had been planned, for a further course of both hyperbaric and laser therapy over a 2-week period. This is about 2 or 3 months later. And then following that, for the first time in 2 years now, she stopped her antibiotics, and she has remained well since then. And when I say since then, that's roughly 6 or 7 years ago. And I've kept in touch with them. and her symptoms have improved and she is now functioning well. So that led me on to, what about lasers? Now, as can happen with entrepreneurs, he took his laser with him when they returned to Auckland, unfortunately. So I then set about getting my own lasers, which I now have, and got me very much involved in this area of potential healing. Lasers basically work with, there's a huge amount of physiological research about how they work. It's really quite well understood. Basically, the main action is that they help the mitochondrial cell wall, where your respiration process is going on, your cytochrome P450s and cytochrome enzymes, in this case, and particularly cytochrome C, and that's a rather complicated slide showing that it definitely affects that. But more than that, oh, by the way, PMB stands for the latest version of the word laser, which is photobiomodulation. Can be either way around, the PMB. And what we know is actually the laser light, which is coherent light at various frequencies, actually helps chromophores, which are protein molecules in our cells, function better. And we know different frequencies affect different chromophores. So in this case, red light or infrared light affects the cytochrome C, but various other frequencies of light affect different chromophores. And by doing that, they have different effects on them. So this is giving you a basic overview of what a red or infrared laser would do, affecting the cytochrome C, and through that increasing ATP production, initially increasing your reactive oxygen species and reactive nitrogen species. And through that process, there's a healing set of sequences that happen, which help various transcriptions of genes. It helps nerves start repairing. It helps a lot of tissues start to repair themselves. And this has been well shown in animal experiments. So that brings me on to the subject of the actual talk, which is how can it be applied to the nervous system? And this is what I want to talk about now. So when they've looked at it, certainly in animal models and to some extent in humans, we know that that use of lasers in the red and infrared level can cause a raft of different things, from increasing synapses, increasing neurons, increasing progenitor cells, preventing apoptosis of cells that shouldn't die, and so forth. So there are lots of good reasons why it might be useful. This is saying, well, okay, what about some very well-known situations like dementia on the right side there, where the cortex is mainly affected, and for Parkinson's disease, where it's more the brainstem that we need to get to. And both of these have started to be looked at, not just in animal models where they have been looked at, but also in human research. How do you get there? Now, this is the question. So you can apply it to the outside of the skull. For things like Parkinson's disease, they're already using very fine fiber optic cables to get down to the substantia nigra and the middle of the brain. It can be used through the nose just as a light because of the cribriform fascia and so on. It's very thin area. You can get to the frontal area of the brain and possibly through the throat. All of these things have been investigated. If we go again to that same model, where how do we get there? So particularly for dementia, but we're going to move on to also traumatic brain injury, we know that you can apply the laser to the outside of the scalp and still get effects within the brain itself. How do we know that? Well, two reasons. One is that there are actually effects when you do randomized controlled trials. And secondly, in cadaver models, they've shown that you get penetration of skull into brain tissue. However, you do get a rapid waning or attenuation as you go deeper. This obviously depends a little bit on the frequency and the power used. I'll just go back. Frequency, the closer you are to the higher nanometer end of the band, the more penetration you get. And the power is as much as is tolerated because of heat. There are direct effects. As I was saying, we know that shining light through the skull does affect the neurons. You do get an increase in both the neurons themselves, they're stimulated, and in the synapses. This is obviously in animal experiments, much easier to do. But there are also indirect effects which weren't expected when it comes to neurological problems. And these are effects where they've shone the laser at the bone marrow, usually in the leg bones. This is initially in animal experiments, but they've now done them in human experiments to show that by doing that, you improve neurological effects. And there's a lot of research going on about how that happens and the chemical and other reactions that happen for that to have a distant effect, often called the abscopal effect, a distant effect of a therapy. In the animal models, as I said, for Alzheimer's disease, it's been used, and we know that in that model, you get a reduction in the hyperphosphorylated tau, which is one of the main chemicals. The myofibril chemicals get tangled in the cells. And also, we know that it affects the amount of amyloid beta plaques. So in the areas we're looking at, which is the neocortex and the hippocampus for memory. So that's from an animal model that's been quite well studied now. When we look at humans, there's only been pilot studies. There's very little in the way of large randomized controlled trials in this area. So I admit that right now. We're dealing with small studies largely. This is a study where there was 11 treatment ones out of 11, sorry, 6 treatment and 3 placebo. And what they did is they used a set of LED lasers. That's this funny looking gadget on the right here, one of the early models, I'm glad to say. And there's a whole process about what frequency, that's the nanometers, and what modulation we use in terms of the frequencies that can be applied. They gave 6 minutes daily treatment for 28 consecutive days, and what they found is in the treatment group versus the placebo, there was a considerable trend towards improvement in various parts of cognitive function. So that was a beginning, and there are lots more trials now going on all around the world, particularly in America and Australasia. There are other effects that occur, and I'm putting this in just out of kind of completion because they've also shown in an animal model, if you actually irradiate the abdomen, which sounds strange, they get some effects on the microbiome when it's unlikely to penetrate to the gut. And there's some very interesting theories about how that actually happens. It can affect the metabolome, which is how your cellular metabolism goes on, and melanocyte stimulation hormone seems to be very important. It's been used in Parkinson's disease. This is a small randomized controlled trial of 17 patients with 18 controls. And they found again that by using a therapy over 9 weeks, they got an improvement in gait speed, which was clinically relevant to p equals 0.001. And that's quite good. It's not a major change, but it's showing that compared to placebo, there was a definite change. And just to let you know, there are an awful lot of trials going on, and these are some of the older ones, and they continue. So I'm not going to go into the massive trials that are going on, a lot of them in animals, but now more in humans. Interestingly enough, it's been used for depression, both in animal and human studies. I'm not going to spend time on this because they've shown in 1 or 2 studies, for instance, that simply shining a laser, infrared laser, quite a strong laser, at the prefrontal lobes, and what they found, the right lobe better than the left lobe, compared to placebo, got a change in NDD, which is, you know, a moderate degree of depression. So that was very interesting, particularly as it was a randomized control. There's lots of other small trials there. The problem we have in trying to understand them and do multi analysis on these things is that they tend to all have different strengths of light, pulsing, wavelength, etc. And until there's more coordination in that level of research, it's going to be difficult to put it all together. It's very much at the forefront of pilot trials at this stage. When it comes to traumatic brain injury, there are lots of reasons for traumatic brain injury, but the great majority are falls. And how common is it? It is quite common in the population, and particularly now we realize in sports, but also various other areas. And even mild traumatic brain injury is becoming well appreciated. We know the symptoms you get from mild traumatic brain injury, which can be any of those, and various other effects on how we behave and how we think. And I certainly see many patients in recent times that have mild traumatic brain injury from what seems like a fairly minor injury, but have quite catastrophic effects in terms of how they can function or their quality of life. Just a reminder that actually for a reasonable proportion of people who've had TBI, it can affect the pituitary. I'm starting to measure this a lot more now. I won't go into this, it's just my interest is also in nutrients. There are various nutrients that may have a benefit in TBI. These are human trial ones, and these are animal trial ones. I won't spend time on them, but just to say they are there if you're interested. But to go on to the laser part, well, there have been trials in both obviously animals and in humans now. Much easier to give a mouse a thump on the head and see what happens. So they've done a lot of this work and shown that even if you give a single dose of the laser, you get a reduction by 50% in the volume of the lesion when you look at 4 weeks. So a dramatic effect if you use it quickly after the injury. If you give prolonged effects, even just for 3 days, you get even better results. So that's very positive. In human trials, again, there's more case series we're looking at. This was a series of just 10 chronic traumatic brain injury patients, and they've shown persistent improvements at 6 months without any significant side effects. And I should just re-mention that when you're using parallel beam lasers, which is what we're talking about, versus cutting lasers, which are focused beams, you're very unlikely to cause any significant side effects unless you look directly at the beam. Another one, a series of 11 in this case, showed improved cognitive function of sleep and less PTSD. There's some very good reasons why it may happen, and I want to just touch on something that you may hear more about if you're interested in this area. Am I okay there, Chappie? I see your face. I'm just making sure I'm on time, all right? Yep. I won't go into this, but there's a whole concept here called a default mode network, which is a series of centers, one at the front in your prefrontal cortex and one in your parietal, or 2 in your parietal lobes. And we know that these are very important in terms of traumatic brain injury. I won't go into too much of this, but this is just a map showing normal, abnormal, and if you subtract one from the other, this is TBI, showing that it's not functioning well. And we realize this is quite important, but the reason I'm showing all that is with lasers, they've shown that you can improve it. And this is, again, part of doing that. Laser therapy for improving that function, the default mode network. And so I'm just letting you know that because we're coming to one of the instruments that does that, and I have no pecuniary interest in this. This is an American gadget. It's called a Bilight. It's got a series of LED laser lights on the central part and over the parietal lobe, and they're showing that they're having some effects in TBIs, which is useful. This is my own laser. Well, I've got both of these. This is a class 4 laser versus a class 3 laser. It's very powerful at 15 watts. And these are some early models. But the one I have also is something called a laser helmet, which has 250 microarrays of lasers in it, which you can modulate in terms of frequency, etc. Very quickly, some case histories, because I think we're coming up to time. One very important one, because this guy was our local barista, a very important member of the community. And he came off his mountain bike, as they do, went over the handlebars, had a minor injury in terms of just concussion, no loss of consciousness. But basically, he remained cognitively messed up for several months afterwards and was unable to work. He just couldn't get it together. So we started using my laser, and we did it for 2 weeks. It made no difference. And I thought, oh, well, this isn't going to work. And then I reviewed the literature, always a good idea, and realized that if you modulate it at 10 hertz, that's where they've had the results. And we did that, and immediate that session and the sessions afterwards, he started to improve. And then he gradually came right and he could go to work. And of course, went back to mountain biking, as you do. This is another woman who had a very serious head injury, a 22-year-old. I won't perhaps spend too long on her, but she ended up being in rehab for nearly a year, intensive rehab for quite a few months. And when I saw her, which was about 3 years after all of this, she was still couldn't walk, couldn't talk, wasn't doing well. And we started treatment, and I'll really rush through it because basically we did hyperbaric oxygen, because that's one of the things we do. And then we went on to, using the laser, which showed improvement each time we treated her. Her parents and her therapist said she picked up in function, and now she's actually walking and talking very well. I'm not saying this happens every time, by the way, but this was just a very dramatic case where there hadn't been improvement over 3 years. Again, you can
probably need to summarize things pretty much.
Okay, I'm going through it. I will go to the summary for you. Sorry to rush it, but basically saying here that the photobiomodulation has definite potential use for both neurological and psychological conditions. We know some of its physiology. It helps various metabolic aspects, which are very positive. And it appears that there will be uses of it more and more in those sorts of conditions as time goes by. Thank you.